The alien Empress and her army saw me fighting alone. And they were shocked part 1. The last soldier standing the valley of Kethmara had no business being beautiful. It was a battlefield. The soil was black with plasma burns. The trees, if you could call them trees, those silver-barked spires that grew on Arindal 4, had been shattered down to their roots. Smoke curled upward in slow, lazy spirals against a sky that was permanently violet, the kind of color that back on Earth would have meant a storm was coming. Here, it just meant Tuesday. My name is Sergeant Dara Osei, and I was the last one left. Not last in the heroic sense, last in the way that a single boot is left after a flood, by accident, by stubborn bad luck, by the universe's indifference to fairness. My squad of 12 had been reduced to me over the course of 7 hours, not by cowardice. Every single one of them went down fighting. Chen held the eastern ridge until a pulse cannon took the entire ridge with him. Vasquez threw herself over a proximity mine to save 3 others, and the 3 others died anyway, 40 minutes later, which is the cruelest math I have ever witnessed. Yemi, our youngest, had lasted the longest beside me. He was 19. He joined because he wanted to see other worlds. He saw them. That counted for something, I told myself. The Vorkai had come to Arindal 6 months ago, and they hadn't come to negotiate. They were a warrior civilization. Tall, gray-skinned, with 4 arms and bioluminescent veins that pulsed gold when they were in combat frenzy. They communicated partly in subsonic rumbles that you felt in your chest before you heard them. They were, by any tactical measure, terrifying. The colonists on Arindal 4 numbered about 3,000. Farmers, mostly. Scientists. A few engineers who maintained the atmospheric processors. They had no standing army. They had us, a single company of the Terran Expeditionary Force that had been dispatched when the first distress signals came. One company against what our sensors estimated to be 40,000 Vorkai warriors. Command had promised reinforcements. That was 6 days ago. Now it was just me. I had 1 pulse rifle, half a charge remaining. 2 plasma grenades. A combat knife. A broken rib from where a piece of debris had caught me 2 hours ago. And I was standing in the middle of Kethmara Valley, which was the last defensive line between the Vorkai advance and the colony's primary settlement. I should have retreated. Every rational calculation pointed that direction. I didn't retreat. I don't fully know why, even now. Part of it was the colonists. 3,000 people, including a school with 200 children who had been evacuating in stages for 3 days. The last transport wouldn't be clear for another 4 hours. 4 hours was a lifetime. Part of it, if I'm honest, was simpler than strategy. I was tired of losing ground. I was tired of watching people I loved die. I was tired of the Vorkai's gold-pulsing veins and their absolute certainty that this world was theirs for the taking. So I stood in the valley of Kethmara, and I waited for them to come. Part 2. The eyes in the sky, what I didn't know. What no one in the Terran Expeditionary Force knew was that we were being watched 60,000 kilometers above Arindal 4, in high orbital position. A vessel sat silent and cloaked. It was not a Terran ship. It was not Vorkai. It was something else entirely, longer than a city, shaped like a crescent moon laid on its side, its hull the deep indigo of space itself, lit by thousands of small amber lights that, from a distance, made it look like a living constellation. It was the Imperial command vessel of the Solveth Dominion, and aboard it was Empress Valeth IV. The Solveth were ancient in the way that geological formations are ancient. Their civilization predated Earth's first single-celled organisms by a margin that made the word old feel inadequate. They had observed humanity for 2 centuries, debating among themselves whether we were worth the diplomatic energy. The prevailing view in their Senate was no. Humans were clever animals, impulsive, tribal, short-lived, and prone to destroying the things they built. The Empress herself had been largely neutral on the question, neither enthusiastic nor dismissive. That was before she saw me. She had been monitoring the Vorkai incursion as a matter of political record-keeping. The Vorkai had been testing Dominion border agreements for decades, and their expansion into this sector was a point of strategic concern. Her fleet of 300 warships could have ended the invasion in an afternoon. But Dominion law was complex on the matter of intervention. You did not spin to a conflict between lesser civilizations without exhaustive deliberation, and the Senate debate had been ongoing for 11 weeks. Empress. Her head tactician, a lean Solveth named Aaron Doss, whose eyes were silver and expressionless, appeared at her side. The last Terran soldier is taking position in the valley. Valeth turned from the observation window. Alone? Yes, the rest of the unit has been eliminated. A pause. The Vorkai forward force approaching the valley numbers approximately 6,000. Valeth returned her gaze to the window, or rather, to the projection that filled it, a real-time composite image drawn from a dozen orbital sensors. She could see the valley in extraordinary detail. She could see the smoke. She could see the burn marks in the silver bark trees. And she could see me, a single human figure, small, standing still in the middle of the valley floor. She is not moving to retreat, Aaron Doss observed, as though this might be news to the Empress. I can see that. She must know the mathematics of her situation. She does, Valeth said quietly. That's rather the point. Part 3. The mathematics of defiance the Vorkai came in waves. The first wave was 300 scouts, fast, light-armored, sent ahead to clear the way. Standard procedure. They expected nothing in the valley. Their sensors would have told them one life sign remained, and one life sign didn't merit tactical formation. I let them get close. Closer than comfortable. I was behind what remained of a fallen tree trunk, breathing through the pain in my ribs, watching their formation through the cracked lens of my scope. I took out their point commander first. Headshot, clean 40 meters. They scattered. That was the thing about an unexpected shot from an unexpected position. It bought seconds of confusion. And in those seconds, I moved. I was already 15 meters to the left when the return fire scorched the ground where I'd been. I rolled behind an outcrop of black rock, fired twice more, 2 more down, and moved again before they could triangulate. I had learned something important in 7 hours of fighting. The Vorkai were powerful and numerous, but they were accustomed to enemies who behaved predictably. They expected lines, they expected formations. They expected enemies to hold position or retreat. I did neither. I was everywhere and nowhere. I used the terrain like a second body, the broken trees, the bomb craters, the jutting rocks. I moved in angles they didn't anticipate. When they sent flankers left, I was already right. When they pushed forward, I pulled them into a narrow defile where their numbers meant nothing, because only 3 could stand abreast. I used my 2 grenades carefully, not together, not wastefully. I used the first to collapse a ridgeline onto a cluster of 12 warriors who were advancing in close formation. The second I saved for 20 minutes and used it to destroy their portable shield generator, which they'd set up thinking they were about to have a static firefight. The first wave retreated. I sat in the crater left by my grenade, hands shaking, forcing myself to breathe slowly, cataloging my resources. Pulse rifle, 30% charge. No grenades. Knife. Broken rib. A cut above my eye I hadn't noticed getting that was bleeding steadily into my vision. The second wave would be different, larger, organized. They'd understood now that something strange was happening. I looked up at the violet sky and said, to no one in particular, 4 hours, come on. Part 4. What the Empress saw in the command vessel, no one spoke. This was unusual. Solveth command decks were places of constant, overlapping communication, tactical readouts, fleet status, sensor reports, all processed aloud in the precise, clipped language of military efficiency. Valeth had stood on this deck for 40 years, and it had never been silent. It was silent now. Every officer, every tactician, every communications analyst had stopped what they were doing and was watching the projection. They had watched me take down the first wave. They had watched me move. Not with the mechanical precision of a combat drone, not with the overwhelming force of a superior weapon, but with something harder to quantify. Something that their tactical algorithms struggled to categorize. She's using the terrain as a force multiplier, Aaron Doss said, his voice carrying a careful neutrality that didn't quite mask the fact that he was genuinely surprised. She has mapped the entire valley in real time and is treating it as an extension of her own offensive capability. She is also injured, said another officer, Solveth Fleet Commander Oreth, who was reviewing bioscan data. Fractured rib, lacerations, elevated cortisol and adrenaline, consistent with extreme physiological stress. She has been in continuous combat for 7 hours and 14 minutes. How long can a human sustain that? Someone asked. The literature suggests they reach critical cognitive and physical degradation well before this point, Oreth replied. Velith said nothing. She watched as the second wave deployed. 900 warriors, organized into 3 flanking arms, exactly the correct tactical response to an agile single combatant. She watched me read the formation and make a decision in seconds that her own analysts were still computing. I went into the center, not because it was safe. It was the most dangerous position on the field, but because the 3 flanking arms were designed to converge on where I was expected to be. The edges. By moving to the center, I forced them to redirect, pulling them off their formation timing, creating gaps. I exploited 2 of those gaps. She understood the formation's weakness before we did, Aaron Doss said. There was something new in his voice now. It wasn't quite reverence. It was closer to the tone a scholar uses when they encounter a primary source they've never seen before. Velith finally spoke. How long until the evacuation transport clears? Approximately 3 hours, 20 minutes. And how long can she realistically continue? Silence. Tell me honestly, Oreth, the fleet commander considered. With her current injury profile, perhaps 40 minutes before physical incapacitation becomes unavoidable. She will try to continue beyond that point, he added, but she will stop being effective. Velith was quiet for a long moment. Below, the second wave had pulled back again. Not a full retreat, but a regrouping. I had bought another fragment of time. What is her name? The Empress asked. Aaron Doss checked the Terran military database they had acquired through passive intelligence. Sergeant Dara Osei, age 31. Born in Accra, on Earth's western continent. Joined the Terran Expeditionary Force at 22. 9 years of service, 17 commendations. He paused. She has a daughter, age 6, named Abena. The command deck was very quiet. Velith looked at her fleet commander. How long has the Senate debate been ongoing? 11 weeks, 3 days. Then it has been going on long enough. She turned to face the full deck, and every officer stood straighter. Because the Empress's voice had shifted into the register, that meant the deliberation was over. We intervene. Full fleet deployment. Target the Vorkai ground forces with precision suppression. I want 0 casualties to the colonists and 0 casualties to Sergeant Osei. Aaron, prepare a landing party. I will be in it. The deck erupted back into its usual controlled noise, but charged now, electric with purpose. Empress, Aaron said carefully. Protocol dictates that you. Protocol, Velith said, was written before I saw a single human hold a valley for 7 hours to save 3,000 people she will never know the names of. Protocol can wait. Part 5. Gold from the sky was on my knees when they came. Not metaphorically. Literally on my knees, behind a rock formation, trying to reload the pulse rifle with hands that had developed a fine tremor I couldn't control. My vision was narrowing at the edges. I had taken a glancing blow on my left shoulder from a Vorkai energy whip 20 minutes earlier, and the entire arm from shoulder to elbow was a solid block of pain. The third wave was assembling, bigger than the previous 2 combined. They weren't scouting anymore. They weren't testing my flanks. They were going to walk through the valley in a wall of force and simply end it. I looked at my rifle. 12% charge. Maybe 6 shots, 3,000 people. 2 hours and 40 minutes. I thought about Abina. I thought about the picture she'd drawn me before deployment. A crayon family portrait in which she had given me a cape, because in her 6-year-old estimation, her mother probably had a cape somewhere and was just not wearing it for some reason. I thought, I'm sorry, baby. I bought what time I could. Then the sky cracked open, not with lightning. With light, the particular, unmistakable light of orbital bombardment, but surgical, precise, controlled in a way that Terran weapons technology couldn't yet manage. It came down in narrow beams of cold blue, and wherever it touched Vorkai formations, warriors scattered, not killed. I would learn later that the Solveth were deliberately using non-lethal suppression, but incapacitated, thrown disoriented, the Vorkai third wave dissolved in seconds, then the ships came lower. Not one ship, dozens of them, small fast landers, deploying from a carrier vessel so large I couldn't see its full outline against the violet sky. They were beautiful in the way that power, when used with precision, can be beautiful. They landed around the valley's perimeter in a ring, and from them came soldiers, tall, silver-armored, each carrying weapons that glowed with that same cold blue, and among them, walking without armor, wearing something that caught the light like woven starlight, was a woman who was clearly not a soldier. She walked toward me. I was still on my knees, which felt humiliating in retrospect. I tried to stand. My legs were having a discussion about that without me. She stopped 3 feet away and we looked at each other. She was tall. Her skin was a deep blue-black. Her eyes were gold. Not metaphorically gold, but actually luminescent, the way a flame is luminescent. And her expression was the most unreadable thing I had ever encountered. Not cold, not warm. Something beyond both, then she knelt. In the dirt of the valley of Kethmara, the Empress of the Solveth Dominion, ruler of 400 star systems, knelt to be level with me. You are Sergeant Dara Osei, she said in perfect English, her voice carrying that same subsonic resonance I associated with the Vorkai, but gentler, like the difference between a war drum and a cello. Yeah, I said. It was not my finest rhetoric. My name is Veleth. I have ruled the Solveth for 60 years. In that time, I have seen 10,000 battles. She paused. I have never seen anything like what you did today. I didn't know what to say to that. I looked at my pulse rifle, still in my hands. I was about out of charge, I know. Something moved across her face. It took me a moment to identify it because I'd never expected to see it there. Emotion. Not performed emotion. Not diplomatic emotion, but the real kind. We should have come sooner, I am sorry. I looked at her for a long moment. The evacuation transport, I said. The colonists are safe. We have intercepted the remaining Vorkai forces on the southern continent. The transport has clear passage. She paused. All 3,000 will reach the relay station. I don't have a word for what happened in my chest then. Relief is too small. It was more like something massive and heavy that I hadn't noticed I was carrying because I'd been carrying it so long, simply lifting away. The shaking in my hands got worse for a moment and then stopped. Okay, I said, and then, because apparently I was going to keep embarrassing myself. Okay, good. Veleth looked at me with those gold eyes, and the expression on her face had settled into something I'd seen before, though never aimed at me. It was the expression people wore for things they intended to remember. The Solveth Dominion, she said, has been observing humanity for 200 years. In our Senate, the debate about whether your civilization merits formal diplomatic engagement has been ongoing for many of those years. She paused. There are those among my advisors who argue that humanity is too young, too volatile, too inconsistent to be reliable partners. They're not entirely wrong, I said. She almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a shift, but it was there. No. But today I watched one human hold a valley against 6,000 enemies for 3 hours and 42 minutes to protect people she would never know, not because she was ordered to. Not because she calculated she could win, but because she decided that those 3 hours were worth the price she was paying. She tilted her head slightly. That is not volatility. That is a particular kind of greatness. It is the kind that civilizations are made of, not just the kind that wins battles. I didn't have anything to say to that. She stood and offered me her hand. I took it, and she pulled me to my feet, easily, like I weighed nothing. The evacuation transport will stop at our vessel before it proceeds to the relay station, she said. The colonists will receive Solveth medical care. And you. She looked at me with that gold gaze, clinical and warm at once. Will receive a great deal of it. I'm fine, I said. You have a fractured rib, lacerations on your scalp and shoulder, a suppressed adrenaline withdrawal that will hit you in approximately. She glanced at something on a thin device at her wrist. 8 minutes. And you have been awake for 31 hours. She raised an eyebrow. You are the furthest thing from fine. 8 minutes. She was off by 2. I made it to 6 before my knees went again. She caught me before I hit the ground. Epilogue. What was built on that ground? I spent 11 days on the Solveth Imperial vessel. I'm told that in that 11 days, more happened diplomatically between humanity and the Solveth Dominion than in the previous 2 centuries combined. Empress Valeth, it turned out, was someone whose instincts drove policy, and her instincts had been decisively recalibrated. The formal diplomatic treaty, the Arundel Accord, was signed 7 months later. It opened trade routes, established mutual defense frameworks, and included a provision that Solveth medical technology, centuries ahead of ours, would be shared with humanity on a graduated basis. Historians now call it the most significant diplomatic achievement in Terran history. I was not consulted during the negotiations. I was a sergeant, not a diplomat, but on the day the treaty was signed, I received a message through secure Solveth channels. It contained no official letterhead. It was just a few lines of text, translated from Solveth script. There is an old saying in the Dominion. Civilization is not what a people build, it is what a people protect. I have updated the saying. Civilization is what a people choose to stand for when the mathematics say they should not. Your daughter's drawing of you is, I am told, very accurate. V don't know how she knew about the drawing. I don't know how she'd accessed a crayon portrait made by a 6-year-old in Accra. I spent a few days being mildly unsettled by this and then decided that if the ruler of 400-star systems wanted to look at my kid's artwork, I was going to choose to be flattered. The Valley of Kethmara was restored by joint Terran Solveth environmental teams. The silverbark trees grew back. The colonists returned. They built a small marker in the center of the valley. Nothing grand, just a flat stone with words on it. I didn't know about it until 2 years later, when Abina was 8, and I took her to see Arundel 4, which by then was no longer a contested frontier world, but a thriving colony with trade routes and a university. We stood in Kethmara on a day when the violet sky was clear and the silver trees were tall and bright, and Abina read the marker out loud in the careful, deliberate way of a child who takes the weight of words seriously. Here, one person held the line not because she could win, but because someone had to. She looked up at me. Was it really you, Mom? It was. She thought about this for a long moment with the gravity that 8-year-olds bring to things they are deciding to believe in. Good, she said finally, and she took my hand. Above us in the violet sky, 3 Solveth trade vessels moved in formation, slow, peaceful, amber-lit like constellations, and the world they crossed was whole.